is that, yes, it may have been to the strategic interest of the United States to support individuals like Mobutu and other individuals like him all over the African continent. However, it's another story altogether if we ask, was this in the strategic interest of Africa? And looking at the current condition in Africa and going back to the question that then Prime Minister Odinga raised about those who simply wanted to kind of constitute a colonial relationship between Africa and the West, it's at least pretty clear that these kinds of relationships with the West and Africa, which only look at their strategic interests, are not good for Africa. At some point, somebody has to say, it's not just a question of giving aid, it is a question of what is in the best strategic interest of the people of Africa, who live on one of the most wealthy continents, but we're constantly caught in this situation of not being able to use those resources for the strategic interest of the African people. Yes, ma'am. So I interviewed a lot of people. I even held several academic panels where I interviewed numbers of scholars as well. And so my choice was, who did I leave on the floor and who did I put in the film? And this really was driven by all of the answers that I got from the people, because I wanted to channel their voices. And I wanted to privilege the voices of those freedom fighters and what they had to say. And so what I cut out a lot of was repetition. But I thought it was very important to reflect the voices which were varied and often we don't hear about. Because a lot of times we look at South Africa and we no longer hear of the Black Consciousness Movement. We no longer hear of the Pan-African Congress. But during that struggle, those people were very important. And to hear their perspective and to see what influence they had and what influenced them, I thought was very important. So my choices were driven by trying to give the perspective that they gave me when I asked them the questions that I did. And that's why some of the answers they gave I didn't agree with. However, I didn't think it was necessarily for me to disagree because there were other people who disagreed. So sometimes I'm trying to give two sides of the point of view. Some were the former president of Ghana, John Kufuor, was a very strong advocate of capitalism. And however, he was one of the few, okay, that made it in, but he really represented that point of view. But I consistently tried to juxtapose his answers with individuals who were not so dedicated to just kind of a pure market-driven capitalism. Yes, ma'am.
I want to expand, on the strategic interest of Africa. There was one gentleman, I forget his name, and you asked, and there was a discussion on China. What are your views on China and Africa?
So this was President Mkapa, and this is the third president of Tanzania. And he was basically offering that China was a strategic partner in the national liberation movements all over the African continent. So at a point when Africans were fighting for liberation, whether it was through getting in the ballot box or using bullets, that China stood there as an advocate and as a supporter. And he gave a particular example when China financed the support of a railroad from Zambia to Tanzania because Zambia is landlocked and needed some way to get its products out. And so his particular example then was that China paid dues by supporting the national independence movements on the African continent. And so that he was offering that China hasn't been doing bad things in Africa. Often China is vilified for its involvement in Africa because it does not maintain a we will decide what and how you define democracy. And so some have found this to be problematic because they have accused China of supporting people like Mugabe, supporting individuals which have been greatly vilified in the West. And so he was offering that this vilification of China in the West does not apply to us because China has been a friend. And China has been a friend in a different way, because he was expressing that he thought China was a friend in supporting Africa for the development of the strategic interest of Africans. Now China comes in a very different space, and the world is a very different place, and China's own economic profile has changed. It is not the China that it was 30 years ago. It is not the China that it was 50 years ago. And so the question about China's involvement in this new platform raises a different set of questions. So these are being hotly contested and debated on the African continent. However, I think even here, the real solution for Africa is to build stronger economic, political coalitions on the African continent in order to negotiate for better deals and better terms with China. So that's what I think. Yes, sir.
The point at the end about the United States of Africa. What are your assessments? Will you see it in your lifetime, do you think? And if it's to come, is it going to make the leap over the Sahara and add the more Arab people on the north side of Africa as well as the people on the south?
So President Kenneth Kaunda was advising me that it's going to happen, but that I shouldn't be so eager, that it may not happen in my lifetime, but it will happen. And he was trying to point to examples showing that it was happening. And so his advice was that you don't really have to worry. And, he went on with a long answer, but let me just give you a summary of what he was cautioning and why he was saying be patient. He said, I've been around for a long time. At some point, people vilified me as being a traitor to Africa. At other points, I was a hero to Africa. And I've gone back and forth many times, but I steadfast believe in Africa's future. And that he didn't think that Africa could progress very far without this kind of unity, but that a lot of things have to happen in order for that unity to be a reality. And I can see the logic and the wisdom in what he was saying, that here's something which is a solution to Africa's problem. It would be beautiful if it happened in my lifetime. I would love to see that. I would love to experience that. I think it would be good for humanity. It would be good for people here in Oakland, California. It would be good for people in Beijing, China. It would be good for the world. So Africa unifying and finding economic and political prosperity would be a good thing for the world. I hope it happens in my lifetime. Do I know it will happen in my lifetime? I don't. However, I think there are indications that Africa will at some point become that unified space. Now, this is a logic which is unfolding everywhere in the world. We see it in Asia, we see it in Europe, we see it in the Americas, and so we will, I believe, see it in Africa as well. Yes, sir.
As an independent filmmaker, how hard or difficult was it to gain access to all the different dignitaries and to travel throughout different regions of Africa?
Excuse me.
This series of international films just the other day that talked about a group of filmmakers that took 3 years or more to see Robert Mugabe. So I'm just asking you, what was your inside role in order to get the interviews that you were able to get?
So let me tell you. So one thing, it took me 7 years to do this. And sometimes we would be waiting a month to see somebody, only to come back 3 years to wait another month to see them, and then come back, some other time before we finally met with them. My access came from work that I have done on the African continent, which had nothing to do with filming. So I've worked a lot in Africa to help African leaders and governments gain control of something as mundane as data about what's going on in the country, and helping develop expertise that could give advice, independent advice, to African leaders about how to do various things and how to evaluate the success or lack of success of development policies, how to counter some of the arguments being presented by various international agencies, from the World Bank to the United Nations, about what the major problems on the African continent were. And so through that process, I've made a few friends. And those friends were very helpful in giving me access to most people. I don't have a problem getting in front of people. The problem is when you want to interview them. Getting in front of them for an interview is a very different enterprise. However, that could get me through the door, if you will. But to actually set up the interview, their attitudes change. Some guys who would meet with me would have me waiting a month to tell me to come back some other time, and that is not an easy prospect when you live 3,000 miles away. But somehow we were able to do it. But it took quite some time. And this wasn't all the leaders that we interviewed, and we're still trying to figure out what are we going to do, because some of this footage, by virtue of who we interviewed, is quite important and valuable in its own right.
So I have a part two question to my question. That is, in Kenya, they mentioned that Moi, when Arap Moi became president, he brought in a lot of his cronies. And I visited Kenya, and I know that Moi was from a really small ethnic group in Kenya. The people were mostly farmers. They wasn't educators. They wasn't intellectuals. And it kind of, how did it affect the country as far as bringing in your own ethnic groups into government, to trying to run the government, and is that still going on?
So it's obviously still going on in Kenya, because Odinga was prime minister. If I finished that thing, I would say 2013, because he just lost in the election for the president. He's contesting it again, as he did for the previous election. But Uhuru Kenyatta, a relative of Jomo Kenyatta, just won the recent election. So, and the tension around the ethnic politics inside of Kenya are very strong, and they continue to be contested. And there is a lot of necessary political development that is going to happen in Kenya before that goes away. If you were in Kenya, then you probably saw some of the impacts of this. I mean, some of the places where you see poverty amidst the level of general economic successes that some of Kenya is having, you see the abject poverty that many people are suffering from. You go to places like Kibera, and you get an indication of the kind of politics which are being played inside of Kenya. But I think that Prime Minister Odinga's point was very well made, in that this has a direct connection to colonialism and the evolution of this type of ethnic politics is directly related to how colonialism was allowed to rule Africa for so long, and that it was in the interest of certain leaders to maintain this kind of politics because it is divisive, but it also allows a concentration of the wealth and the resources of the country. And, and Kenya is an example of this concentration of wealth and resources in the hands of a few. Uhuru Kenyatta is not only now the head of the country, he's also known to be the most wealthy man in the country.